When working in the analog domain, there is one word that can bring even the most road-hardened, road-tested engineer to their knees. Recall. Okay, maybe that's a little bit dramatic, but seriously, one of the downsides, if not the only downside of working out in the analog domain or even a hybrid setup, is having to do recalls. It's one of the things as mix engineers we do our best job to try to avoid, but at some point it's inevitable. You're gonna have to do a recall. And if you enjoy working in the analog domain, like I do, the quicker you accept that and just try to come up with a workflow or a system that allows you to do recalls as fast and as painless as possible, the better off you're gonna be and the happier you're gonna be. Most of us, I would assume, are not working with assistants, or at least I'm not. So I have to do all of this myself. You know, I do all the recall myself, I take all the notes myself. So I've been really diligent to find a system that I can do consistently that makes my life easy in the event that I have to do a recall. I love working out in the analog domain. Sometimes I'm using everything, sometimes it's only the console as a summing mixer. I have certain things that I do kind of on a regular basis. I like the sound of it. It's not a digital versus analog debate whatsoever. I just like working this way. It's fun to me. And I want to have fun while I'm working. That is a huge part of making music. So I've just chosen to work this way, knowing that sometimes I'm gonna have to do a recall. But it's not always a huge pain in the ass. The first thing I do at the end of every session is print stems. This is right off the bat. Printing stems has saved me from doing recalls 98% of the time. So I may run a drum stem, a bass stem, rhythm guitars, maybe solo guitars or melody guitars. Maybe there's some keyboards or lead vocal, background vocals, maybe some doubles. Usually it's gonna be probably somewhere between maybe 10 and 14 stems. On a really big session, especially if I'm running a lot of outboard gear, it could be a bit more than that. Sometimes I'm only using the board as a summing mixer, and then it might only be, 6 or 7 stems. But I leave myself enough flexibility that if I have to do some sort of recall or revision, I can do it from the stems. Most of the time it's, can you turn the vocal up here, or the vocal's too loud, or, the guitar needs to come up. It's something simple like that. So I can do that right from the stems. It takes a matter of minutes. I'm recalling really 2 channels, just 2 channels. Usually I'd pull it up on 23, 24, put my mix bus stuff there, print it back in, done. Nice and simple. It does take a little bit of time at the end of the session, but I have a system. I set up groups in Logic. So all I do is I solo up those groups and I arm the print machine and I hit play on this machine and it does it. And I can go do other things. I can take other notes. Usually I'm taking other notes while I'm printing stems, which I'm gonna get to. That's number 3 today. I'm gonna get to that in just a second. So I'm doing something while I'm printing stems. So it actually doesn't really take me a whole lot of extra time to do that. The second thing I do is take a few notes about my outboard effects settings and put them in the DAW. And for me, that's Logic. It's got this handy notepad that allows me to take some notes on a per track basis or on a project basis. And this mix is one I just finished for the thrash band Mortalis. And you can see I have a few notes here about my aux sends and what is on those aux sends. That way I can real quick just look in here, I can look over at my effects over here and make sure that I have the proper programs up. And then I also know what aux sends I was using. And in some cases, I'm actually sending out an output for an effect from Logic out to another channel on the console going somewhere, and I would notate that in there as well if I was doing that. But in this case, I was just using 4 different auxes, 2 stereo auxes and 2 mono auxes, and I have some notes on what they are. This is really just a redundancy for my main system, but I just like to be thorough, so I go ahead and put all my notes there in Logic. Over the years, I have tried multiple ways to take notes. I've done recall sheets. I've made my own recall sheets where I took photos and for every piece of gear, and I could go write down exactly where the setting was and make any notes on the back of the page. I've taken photos. I mean, I have so many photos still on my laptop from old mixes, just thousands of them. And while that stuff works, it is cumbersome. It takes forever. And there's a lot of things that you can miss even with a photo. And if you're trying to sit and literally handwrite all that stuff for every single channel and every single piece of outboard gear, especially if you're using a lot of gear, man, it just takes a lot of time. Too many things to miss. So I've come up with a much better system. that allows me to do it more accurately and considerably faster. My main workflow is simple. It's an iPhone and a selfie stick. And I walk through everything. And I do it in the same order every single time. And I start simply by saying, this is Mix Recall, the artist in this song. In this case, it's Mix Recall for Mortalis Iron Jungle. And I start with faders, even though I'm using the automation, and the panning. And I'm gonna go faster than I usually do. I go slower so I can really see it. But I have my tracks coming up in the same places on the board all the time, so I know what channels they're in. And then I'll get over to the master or the bus section, and I'll go through that, and I'll get as detailed as I possibly can, and go through it all. The next thing I do is I come back over to the start, and now I'll go through anything that I have on inserts, and that's always written below the faders. So in this case, the kick drum, it's one of the SSL compressors into one of the TS500 tape emulators. And then I'll go through each one of those, and I'll have everything written that I'm using. And then once I get through that, I go up to the effects returns. And usually I can point, and I'm almost always pointing at what I'm talking about so I can see it, make any notes of any EQ I have, and then I'll go over to my auxes and go through all my effects sends. So in this case, like channel 2, the snare is being sent to aux 7 and 8, which is the M3000. Then I'll go over here to the toms being sent to 7 and 8, which is the M3000, and I'll go through every single send. I can point to it. I make sure that I can see exactly where the settings are. Right now I'm throwing a lot of light in here. Usually I only have one overhead light, so it's really easy to see. And then I'll move up the board to my EQs, and I'll go band by band here. So for the kick, I would go, kick is in, I'm using the low cut. I have no low boost or cut. I'm pulling a little bit of low mid. I'm pushing some high mid. I'm pushing some high end. The insert is on. It is not pre-EQ insert. And this is where video is way better than photos or even notes. These buttons that have no lights can get really difficult to tell when they're on or off in a photo. So this way I can tell myself, the kick is not pre-EQ insert. The snare is pre-EQ insert. And I go through every single channel that has EQ or an insert on that way. Then I move up the board one more time, and I make any notes about what is being sent to what subgroup or out the main mix. And I'll go through the whole setup that way. Once the console is done, I go through outboard gear, and I usually start at the beginning. So in this case, the kick is the SSL number 1 into TS500 number 1. So I would go over here. I'll go SSL, you got a little bit of too much light there, it's hard to see, there we go. SSL number 1, I would see the settings, I can talk myself through it, I can tell myself if any of these buttons are on, which they're not. Again, these are really hard to see in a photo. I can say whether I have the expander on or not, and then I would go down to the first tape emulator, and I would go through all of that. And then I would go to the next channel, and the next channel until I've gotten through all of my gear on the channels. Then I would go to my buses. So like the drum bus is the Rupert Neve 535 into the EQ 5P. So I'd go over to the 535s. I got a little bit of a glare here. And I would just go down this, and if I needed to tell myself anything here, which I don't, this is pretty easy to see. And then I would go up to the EQ5P. And in this case, I am just pulling some low mid, and I am doing a little bit of a shelf on the top, and it's the same on both channels. And I would do that for every single piece of gear. And I would even go through the outboard effects. Even though I made notes in Logic, I would still film all of that. I would film the master bus, which usually doesn't change very much. So I will get every single bit of that on film or on hard disk. And this way I can also tell myself if I have things routed to line inputs, if there's something special routing wise in the patch bay. I just literally go over and I walk myself through it. So when I have to do a full recall, this video gets stored in the project folder. I just add an extra folder called Mix Recall. I pull it up on this screen right in front of me, QuickTime, and I hit play, and I literally talk myself through setting up the entire recall. It takes between 10 and 15 minutes for me to shoot this, but I'll do this while I'm bouncing stems. That way I'm doing both of those things at the same time, so it's quicker. When I go to set up a recall, I'm just talking myself through it. It's so accurate, and it doesn't take me that long to actually get, well, it depends on how much stuff I'm using. You know, if I'm really going nuts and using everything, it still takes a little bit, but it's not really that hard, and it's really accurate. And that's how I deal with recalls. And since I've started using the phone and walking through, I don't dread it as much anymore. It doesn't happen that often that I have to do a full recall. It's pretty rare. But when I do, having this video has made life so much easier. The final thing that I do, well, this actually isn't the final thing. I do this before I even print the stems, but I'm just saving it till last now because it's not technically part of the recall, but I will always print a few different versions of the mix. Usually there'll be a vocal up or vocal down depending on the style. If it's something that's really heavy on guitar solos, I might do the same thing with guitar solos. I will sometimes even print different versions with some EQ. Maybe I'm only doing a smiley face, a little low and a little high. Maybe I'll print one where I do something in the mid or the high mid, you know, a dB or a couple dB just pushed. Or maybe I'll do a different silk or something, or sometimes I'll even just hit the Rupert Neves, the tape emulators, a little bit harder and get something a bit more saturated. And I just go ahead and run all of that stuff off right when I'm doing a mix. And I print an instrumental and a vocal version as well. And then if the client has requested, you know, maybe there's a TV mix or that sort of thing, acapella and everything else can get taken from the stems. Most of the time we don't ever use them, but there have been a few times where we went in the mastering process and went, oh man, this alternative print is sounding better coming through the mastering process, so we go ahead and use that. And sometimes that alone saves me from having to do any sort of recall. And that is my full process for making notes on a mix once I've done. Everything I do that might head off having to do a full recall, but also everything I do that gives me all the information I need accurately to do a full recall if needed. How do you take notes if you're using analog gear or working on a console? Let us all know in the comments. Hope you guys enjoyed this. If these videos are helpful or you enjoy them, please hit the like and subscribe, hit that notification bell. Consider using the thanks because that really helps the channel. We really, really appreciate it. And I will see you all in the next video. Happy recording, happy mixing, and I hope you don't have to do too many recalls.